Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be looking into something a little different. It's kind of strange at first, but we're going to be talking about a connection between our Russian physiologist from the early 1900s and the ads we see, like all the time, every day.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating link. Most people know this guy, Ivan Pavlov, from his work with dogs, but his research actually had a huge impact on the world of advertising.
Right. I mean, everyone's heard of Pavlov's dog, but to really get how it applies to us, we kind of need to, revisit the actual experiment itself. So Pavlov, he was originally studying digestion in dogs. He actually won the Nobel Prize for it in 1904. But during his research, he noticed something pretty interesting. So dogs naturally salivate when they see food.
Yeah.
That's an unconditioned response. It's like a total instinct reaction.
Exactly. It's just natural. But then he introduced a neutral stimulus, a bell, and rang it every single time right before feeding the dogs.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Over time, those dogs started associating the bell with the food. And eventually, they'd even start drooling just at the sound of the bell. Even without any food being present, they were drooling.
So that bell, which was totally neutral at first, it became a conditioned stimulus. It was triggering that conditioned response.
Yeah.
And what Pavlov showed was that through, just repetition, you could create a learned association in the brain. And that essentially meant you could turn something that was completely neutral into a trigger for something else. It's funny, actually, my cat goes bonkers at the sound of the treat bag opening now, like classic Pavlovian conditioning.
That's a perfect example of how this happens in, everyday life. But here's the really crazy thing. So Pavlov died in 1936. Radio advertising was just taking off in the 20s, and TV ads, they didn't even exist until 1941. So his work was, in a way, totally ahead of its time. He basically uncovered this fundamental principle of learning that advertisers, whether they even realized it or not, were going to use later to their advantage.
Yeah, it's like he laid the groundwork without even realizing what a big impact his findings would have on marketing and, our understanding of how consumers behave. So how did this all translate to advertising? Well, think about it. We're always being bombarded with ads that use similar techniques to associate products with stuff we already have positive feelings for.
Okay, so let's take Coca-Cola as an example. We all have a basic, unconditioned need to drink water. It's essential, right? We got to have water.
Right. Our natural thirst is the unconditioned stimulus. And what Coca-Cola has done so well, incredibly well, is they've managed to take their product, which is essentially sugar and water, and through their ads associated with all sorts of positive things like, emotions and experiences, family, friends, holidays, happiness, you name it. They've really tied it all together.
It's almost like they've, hijacked our natural thirst response and just tied it right to their product. And they're so subtle about it. Remember that Coca-Cola commercial with the grandpa rushing to the hospital? They don't even show the product until the very end. But the whole ad is designed to, to make you feel good, to elicit this really heartwarming, positive, emotional response.
And that positive feeling, it gets transferred to Coca-Cola, even though logically it has nothing to do with the product itself. That's the power of Pavlovian conditioning and advertising. But it's not just Coca-Cola, right? Think about how often we see beer commercials during sporting events. It's become so ingrained that my nephew was actually surprised when he saw me drinking milk during a football game.
It's true. We're so used to seeing those associations that anything different just feels out of place. But this is where it gets kind of, worrying, this conditioning. It isn't always used for, harmless things like soda. It can be applied to products and behaviors that aren't good for us at all. Think about junk food, unhealthy habits, or even potentially harmful ideologies.
Oh, absolutely. And with the internet and social media, we're exposed to these techniques constantly. We're scrolling, clicking, liking, sharing, and all of that data is being used to refine these advertising techniques even more. It's kind of crazy how good they're getting at influencing our behavior. It really makes you wonder, are we really making our own choices, or are we just responding to these really carefully crafted triggers? Like Pavlov's dogs responding to that bell.
It's kind of scary when you think about it that way. We want to think that we're the ones making the choices, but so much of how we behave is shaped by these associations that we've built up over time. And a lot of the time we don't even realize it's happening.
Absolutely. And advertisers, they've gotten really good at how they use these techniques.
Yeah.
It's not even just simple pairing anymore. It's more about understanding the psychology of what makes us tick.
While I was reading up on this stuff, I learned that advertising has been around for a long time. Like, did you know that back in ancient Rome, they had acta diurna, which were basically like public notices posted in the forum? They were like ancient billboards.
Wow, I didn't realize it went back that far.
Yeah, and then in 6th century China, they had town criers spreading the word about, goods and services. It's crazy how much it's changed.
It's amazing how advertising is just adapted, along with technology and the more we learn about human behavior. But the core of it, it's still about those same basic principles that Pavlov found, creating associations and triggering predictable responses. But how those principles are applied today, it's so much more subtle.
Can you give us an example of what you mean by that?
Well, look at something like scarcity tactics, limited time offer or only a few left in stock. You hear that and you think, oh, I got to get it now. It triggers that fear of missing out. It makes us make impulse buys. Like it just plays on our desire to get something we think is valuable before it's gone.
Right, right. It's kind of like when you see a huge line outside a restaurant, you automatically assume, oh, that place must be good. I want to try it too.
Exactly. That's another technique.
Yeah.
Social proof. We tend to follow the crowd. If everyone else is doing it, it must be good. And advertisers use this by showing testimonials and reviews, or even just pictures of lots of people enjoying their product.
So it's not just about associating a product with something good. It's about creating this urgent feeling that you have to be a part of something.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's stuff like influencer marketing, which taps into our desire to be like people we admire or trust. Like when someone we follow online recommends something, it just carries more weight than, some random ad because it feels more personal.
That's true. It's like getting a recommendation from a friend, right? It just feels more genuine, less like they're trying to sell you something.
And this is all happening, in a media landscape that's always changing and becoming more personalized.
Mm-hmm.
Companies can now tailor their messages to specific demographics, interests, even our past browsing. Like they can predict what we want before we even know it ourselves.
It's both impressive and kind of creepy at the same time, right? The more we learn about these techniques, the more it feels like our choices are being made for us and we're not even aware of it.
I know what you mean. That's why it's so important to be aware of these tactics and trying to look at advertising with a critical eye. 2 books that I think are really good on this are Homo Videns by Giovanni Sartori and The Shallows by Nicholas Carr.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those. They're both about how media, can have negative effects on our minds, right?
Exactly. Sartori argues that the fact that we're so focused on visual media, especially TV, has created this generation of what he calls video children who aren't as good at critical thinking and are more easily manipulated. He thinks that, being constantly bombarded by images, often without context, can actually hurt our ability to think abstractly and analyze things properly.
And Carr's book, The Shallows, is more about how the internet, affects our attention spans.
Right. He argues that, how the internet is with all the hyperlinks and the jumping around, it encourages us to just skim stuff and multitask, which can actually make it harder to concentrate and really think deeply about something. He even compares the internet to slot machines with the notifications and updates, constantly vying for our attention.
So both of these books are basically saying that too much passive media consumption makes us more vulnerable to these kinds of manipulative tactics.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. It's not that all media is bad, but we need to be careful about how we consume it and make sure we're still using our critical thinking skills.
So is there anything we can do to fight this? Can we somehow uncondition ourselves from these automatic responses?
It's hard, especially with how much we're exposed to these messages all the time. But one thing psychologists talk about is dehabituation. Basically, it's about consciously interrupting those automatic responses, trying to break the link between the stimulus and the conditioned response.
Okay, but how would someone actually do that? In real life, can you give me an example?
Sure. So let's say you're walking down the street, you see a billboard for, McDonald's.
Right.
Instead of just letting your mind automatically go to, juicy burgers and fries, you can choose to look away from the billboard. Or even just actively think about something else, like how nice the weather is or, what you're going to do later.
So just redirecting your attention and breaking that habitual response.
Exactly. It takes practice, but over time, you can weaken those automatic associations and get some control back over your reactions.
That's a good place to start. But what about the more subtle stuff? like how they use language in advertising. Like before, we were talking about Coca-Cola and how they use positive associations. But then I saw something on their label and I was like, really? They actually have reduced sugar on the label as if it's now healthier or something.
Oh, yeah. It's a classic example of how language can be used to, change how we see things. The term reduced sugar, it implies that it's healthier, but, it's still a sugary drink. And it can still cause health problems. And the crazy thing is they usually print it right next to that government warning about how much sugar and calories it has.
It's kind of funny, actually, how obvious it is. Like, do they think we won't notice the contradiction?
It shows how important it is to, read labels carefully and not just believe everything marketing tells us.
Yeah.
You got to think critically and do our own research, especially when it comes to things that affect our health.
That's so important. We can't just accept everything we're told. We have to question things, analyze them, and make our own informed choices. But I gotta admit, it's exhausting to constantly be on guard against this stuff.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot to take in. But remember, being aware is the first step. Once you start to recognize these techniques, you're in a better position to make your own choices.
It's like we're constantly battling, between what we actually want and these like automatic responses that are just so ingrained.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a tough balance to strike. And the more we understand about these techniques, the better we can deal with that.
But doesn't it kind of make you feel, I don't know, like bummed out to think that something as basic as choosing a drink or a snack can be messed with by all this complex psychology? Like, are we all just puppets, just doing whatever advertisers want us to?
I don't think it's that bad. We still have a choice. We can still decide what to do. But yeah, being aware of it all is super important. The more we get how these techniques work, the less they can influence us, It's like knowing the rules of a game. It gives you an advantage.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not about like rejecting all advertising or getting all cynical. It's more about being a smarter consumer.
Exactly. It's about being mindful of all the messages we're getting hit with and asking ourselves, do I really want this? Or am I just reacting to some trigger they set up?
So it comes back to that awareness thing, right? Like questioning our own automatic reactions. It's like that saying, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. It reminds you that in this day and age, our attention is valuable, and companies are always fighting for it.
And, they're getting really clever about how they do that. One area where it's really obvious is political advertising.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I didn't really think about that. How does Pavlovian conditioning, work in political campaigns?
Well, politicians are basically selling themselves, right? Their ideas, their vision. And they often use those same techniques that advertisers do to make people associate good things with their brand, which in this case is their political platform or their candidacy.
So instead of connecting a product with happiness or satisfaction, they're connecting themselves with things like patriotism, security, hope for the future, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. They use strong imagery, catchy slogans, and well-crafted stories to tap into our values and beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Think about how often you see politicians standing in front of American flags or surrounded by families. It's all about making you feel patriotic and, together.
Or how they use language to make you feel like there's some big threat or like you need to act now, like warnings about danger or our way of life being threatened. It's all about getting a reaction out of you, even if it means you don't think about it rationally.
Right. And it works, especially when they play on our fears and insecurities. That's why it's so important to be really careful about the political stuff we see and to do our own research. Don't just believe everything you see in a campaign ad,
It makes you realize this is bigger than just buying some product. It's about how we see the world, what we believe in, our values. It's about how we think and act.
And the stakes are high. It affects our health, our money, our political system, everything.
So what can we do? Can we actually break free from all this conditioning and manipulation?
It's hard, but not impossible. Like we said, awareness is the first step. But we also got to use our critical thinking skills. Question things, look for different viewpoints, and be careful about easy answers to complicated problems.
Be skeptical, not cynical, right? Be informed, not overwhelmed. Take control back and make choices that match what we believe in.
Yeah. Be active in the world. Don't just sit back and let whatever information comes at you control you.
That's a great point. It's good to know we're not totally helpless against all this stuff. We can choose to be aware, critical, and engaged.
And it's a journey. You don't have to be perfect. Just keep learning and growing.
So next time you find yourself grabbing that can of soda or clicking on that ad without thinking, just stop for a second. Think of Pavlov's dog and ask yourself, is this really what I want?
And if it's not, choose something else. Break free from that automatic response and make your own choice.
We've talked about a lot today, from some Russian guy's lab to modern advertising and even more. It's been quite a ride.
It has, and it's a conversation we should keep having.
Totally. Everyone listening, keep thinking about these things. Keep questioning, keep learning. The more we get how our minds work and how they can be manipulated, the better we can deal with this crazy world.
And who knows? Maybe you'll find some of your own conditioned responses you didn't even know you had.
That's true. It's like a deep dive into your own head. So until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and stay informed. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the wild world of Pavlov and advertising.